Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbites. Today I have a gentleman with me I haven't seen in years, and I'm very excited that he's here. Jeff Wennberg, who's the Commissioner of Rutland's Public Works. Jeff, welcome.
Pleasure to be
like
here,
that
Pat.
tagline, Listening Beyond the Soundbites.
That's perfect.
The explanation is if they say it's free, you better ask some questions. That's
And hold on to your
Yes,
wallet.
exactly. Anyway, Jeff and I, we worked together when you were at A&R.
Yep.
And I haven't seen you too much since, so I'm very sad about that. And you have got the most amazing background. When I was doing my research, I said, where do you find the time? I'd like you to tell our viewers a little bit about yourself. We only have an hour, so.
She knows me too well.
Short.
You know me too well. Okay, well, I was mayor of Rutland from 1987 to 1999.
Right.
So it was 6 terms. And then I worked for a solid waste district manager. And then Governor Douglas got elected, and I was appointed to Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation.
Right.
I served there for a little under 5 years. And then I left. I went out and did some private consulting for about 5 years. And that was fascinating because it was national. So I was traveling around the country, meeting people. And when you're doing environmental and energy consulting and you're working in New York and Kentucky at the same time.
Cultural
Oh,
shock.
yes. It's a very, and it was not difficult keeping the two kind of straight because it was such radically different. But it was a wonderful experience to do that. And then the mayor, former mayor, Chris Loris, gave me a call about 5 years ago, 4.5, 5 years ago. And he said, this was wonderful, he said, rumor has it in City Hall that every time the Commissioner of Public Works went on vacation, you ran down the other end of the hall and did his job for him. And I said, every word of that is absolutely true. That's exactly what I did. And then he said, well, are you sitting down? And I said, okay. And he said, how'd you like the job for real? And here I am.
That's great. And it reminded me, I think Rutland has the largest treatment facility in Vermont, is that correct?
Right, because we just have the one wastewater treatment plant,
right,
and it serves several communities, not just the city. So, you know, it reaches all the way up the Killington Basin, pumps over the mountain, and then everything down Route 4. Most of the industrial and commercial areas in Rutland Town are on the system, as well as out in Clarendon, Industrial Park in Clarendon. So the footprint is really rather large, but there's only the one wastewater treatment plant. Wow. So it's by good margin the biggest one in the state.
Yeah, right. Well, I worked for a little while, well, 10 years, for Barry City. And I had to do, you know, job descriptions and the things that municipalities like never do. And I was working with the guy who was the head of the wastewater treatment, and I don't think people have a clue that this is a 24/7, minute by minute. Anything can go wrong at any second, and you better be prepared to respond.
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that you mentioned that, because there's a public appreciation, and it's appropriately put for first responders, you know, EMTs and firefighters and police, and that's appropriate. People, you know, just, you know, when it hits the fan over here, they run toward it while everyone else is running away.
Exactly.
But the folks who work especially in wastewater collection and in wastewater treatment, every bit the same. They are dealing sometimes with life-threatening, certainly with environmental or public health-threatening issues.
You can wipe out a stream pretty easily.
On a daily basis, and knowing the right thing to do and being there and working as a team. And we've had multiple examples of that at our treatment plant in the 4 years I've been there, when birds flew into power lines and there's this giant power surge that wipes out half of the plant and never had a violation.
Oh, wow.
They knew exactly what to do and how to keep things going. There were fires going on in electrical rooms and things like that, and they handled it perfectly. And Green Mountain Power deserves a lot of credit too, because they came in and they were right on the spot too. But on a day-to-day, or when there's a storm or an emergency like that, those folks do as much to protect public health, to protect the environment, and to protect our investment, our infrastructure investments, as much as anybody in the more commonly understood first responders community. We cannot thank them enough, because they don't do it for accolades. As a matter of fact, our guys, and I know they're typical, our guys in wastewater treatment, they kind of rank or evaluate their success on the degree to which people never have to think about what happens after they flush.
Right.
You know, it's just
Or
like it's
turn
going to be
that
taken.
faucet in the kitchen, right?
It's going to be taken care of. I don't
Yeah.
even have to think about where it goes or what happens to it. All I know is that the streams are protected and everything's fine. And to the degree that people can do that and do that day in and day
Right.
out, that's how our guys measure success. You don't even have to think about it. But that doesn't mean that they are willing to get denigrated or chastised for things when they're actually doing their job right. And we've had some examples of that where some folks who are agenda driven, and I even agree with their agendas, but sometimes when events happen like combined sewer overflows or things like that, they use those events to instill public fear, and the implication is that somebody screwed up. And while sometimes that does happen, I won't minimize that, the vast majority of the times it's the system working exactly as it was designed, and the people responded exactly the right way.
Right.
And yet there's this big public outcry because the public doesn't really understand this, and there are folks out there who fan the flames. And that's unfortunate,
Well,
because
it's
these
sad
guys
'cause
deserve a pat on the back.
I'm sure the minute there's a flood, those guys are out, worried
Yeah.
about the sewers, and I mean, it's just, I was fascinated. It was really amazing to be in that building and watch the effluent and just watch what they have to do, and that's every minute they've got to be watching.
Yep.
Yes, well, thank you all very much. Appreciate it. We should add that to the list of people we thank, I think. Anyway, the reason I asked Jeff on the show, because I have not really seen him in a while, is I read an article, I got to read this so I get it right, that you are chair of an EAP advisory committee concerning the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, which is made up of U.S., Mexico, and Canada.
Yeah.
That is just fascinating. Could you explain that to us?
I've been on and off of there for about 10 years now.
It was a big article, though, so you were up to something.
Well, yeah, it just happened to hit the Vermont press, I think. The Commission for Environmental Cooperation was created under the environmental treaty between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico that went in with NAFTA. You remember when the North American Free Trade Agreement went in. There was a lot of concern that environmental standards in the three nations are so different that, Canada and the U.S., this was the general argument, would it be at a competitive disadvantage because companies could move to Mexico and they wouldn't have to meet the same standards. And there's a little bit of that between the U.S. and Canada too, but not so much. So those concerns were addressed by a separate treaty called the North American Agreement for Environmental Cooperation.
Good job.
Lovingly referred to as the NAAC. No one knows about
NAAC
this.
and NAFTA and
Yeah, all of that. So under that treaty, each nation has the opportunity, they don't have to, but they have the opportunity to appoint two advisory committees, a governmental advisory committee and a national advisory committee. And for, I don't know, about 6 years, I've chaired the governmental advisory committee, which is made up of state, local, and tribal representatives. And I've learned a lot, especially about the southern border. That I was fascinated to get on this because I know nothing about issues in the southern border, and boy, have I learned a lot. The National Advisory Committee is made up of academics, industry, and NGOs. So the two committees meet together. They have separate chairs, and then we just co-chair. We take turns running the meeting, and then we go off and develop our advice separately. And we do our advice in the form of a letter. It's on the EPA website. If you just Google search EPA GAC NAC, it'll take you to the page and you can see the letters and the response letters from EPA and all the rest of that. So we advise the United States government on things of interest, environmental and public health interest for North America, and also having to do with trade as well.
So two questions come to mind. One is you're certainly not just representing Vermont, you are representing the US of A. How do you keep a handle on all the issues, or in the environment, is it pretty much the same water, air?
Well,
How do you
yeah,
do
I
that?
mean, it is very much, as we often say between states, that pollution doesn't obey political boundaries.
Right, it doesn't stop.
And it doesn't stop at national boundaries either. We have a very good, especially in the Northeast, very good and long-standing relationship with the maritime provinces in Quebec, the Eastern Canadian provinces between New England and there. I'm sure you remember those
Yes,
days.
I do.
Governor Douglas
I do,
was
yes.
one of the best governors ever
Right.
in terms of fostering and building on that relationship. But that's not the case everywhere else along the borders. And so this is an international group. The actual commission is made up of the environmental ministers, the U.S. Administrator, U.S. EPA Administrator, the Minister of Environment, Catherine McKenna from Canada, and the Secretary of SEMARNAT, which is the environmental agency in Mexico. And they three meet once a year, and that was the meeting in Prince Edward Island that I went to. That was part of the article. And they meet once a year. Our committees meet twice a year to develop advice to prepare the United States government or to advise the United States government on issues of concern and what should be brought up.
There's no enforcement responsibility. Do you
That's
have
a
enforcement powers?
Fascinating question.
I'm just curious why, if you're doing all, because it sounds so intriguing to me, why you don't have, if you don't do this, here's what will happen.
Well, they do not have enforcement powers. However, that was a concern when all of this was put together. So they came up with this provision in the treaty for submissions on environmental matters, SEM. Everything has to have an acronym. SEM, submissions on environmental matters. And this is a process. The CEC is administered by a secretariat, which is located in Montreal. Very handy for us here.
Right.
And that's where these things are adjudicated and where the programs of the CEC come out of. CEC doesn't have a ton of money. I think it's, oh my goodness, $9 million a year from each country, something like that.
Right.
It's not a lot of money. But they do a lot with it. And if you go to the cec.org website, you can see the mapping is amazing. And a lot of the programs they have grants, relatively small grants for local communities. But anyway, they came up with this submission on environmental matters. And what it is it's a very kind of bureaucratic process. But if a community or a group in any one of the three nations believes that their country or a neighboring country is not enforcing their own environmental laws, and they've exhausted, going through the courts or whatever, they've exhausted their remedies at the national level, they can make a petition to the CEC to create what's called a factual record. And they will do an if the CEC agrees to take it up and has to meet strict criteria, if they agree to take it up, they do an exhaustive investigation to find out, okay, what is the issue? And some of the biggest issues between Mexico, U.S., and Canada, U.S., have gone through this process over the years. This goes back 20 some odd years. So, and there is no recommendation that comes out of it. There's no enforcement authority. But what they do is they just lay out, okay, here are the facts, and here's what's happened. And they make it painfully obvious that either the person or group bringing forward the petition is all wet, and yeah, the environmental laws have been enforced to the degree they can be, or yeah, looks like the government maybe isn't doing their job here, but that's where it stops. It's just the light of day. It's just exposing it for everybody to see.
But facts that could probably be handy in a court, maybe.
Yeah, usually you have to have exhausted your legal remedies before they'll even take it up.
Oh, okay. So
it's not used for that purpose. Yeah.
Okay. So what are there are key differences you said between Mexico and the United States, and then Canada and the United States? What are those issues that you deal with?
Oh my goodness, they go on forever. But I think this relationship has had a measurable effect at leveling the playing field. Are we completely all on the same page? No.
No,
probably never will be.
Right.
These are three sovereign nations. Probably never will be. But is Mexico doing a better job, and are the regulatory systems in Mexico noticeably or significantly closer, in some cases the same, as the United States and Canada for some of these key issues? And the
Is
answer
carbon
yes.
one of the issues? I'm just trying to think what
what?
those issues could or would be. Are there manufacturing with carbon emissions? Is that that travels over
Yes.
our lines, our
climate
borders?
and carbon
Climate,
emissions have
yeah.
been an issue. I was first appointed under George W. Bush. It is a presidential level advisory committee.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Good
But you're
for
not
you.
actually appointed by the president. It's just that's how they. That's
get
how
a
they,
seal
it's the
somewhere.
highest. It's the highest level in the U.S. government.
That's
but because of the nature of the advice that they give.
Yeah.
But the president doesn't know who's on it. Believe me, I'd be astonished if that were the case. But the administrator of U.S. EPA approves all the names and that kind of thing. So under the Bush administration, I was first appointed, and that was that group, and they basically, the standard rule is don't talk about climate. We're not going to have you deal with climate. Then after a couple of years, the Bush administration lightened up, and they said, okay, we want some advice on climate. What can be done in North America on climate? So we tiptoed into those waters at that time. Then Obama came in, and there are about a dozen people, it varies within a few, but there are about a dozen people on my committee, the Governmental Advisory Committee, and only two, myself and one other, survived the culling at the change of the administration.
Says a lot.
Well, I was rather shocked, because I'm a Republican and all, but for some reason, they...
but this isn't, I know people are going to get, this isn't really a Republican issue. It's just
It isn't.
It's a common sense, how do we survive issue. Correct?
It isn't. And I have to say, the Obama people appointed some really high-quality people. And then I was term limited out after 6 years. So I was chair for the last 4 years. I was on it, and then you're term limited out, and I got my plaque and everything. I got all that.
You
Fine.
should have brought it.
So 2 years later, I get a call from EPA headquarters, and they said, "How'd you like to come back on the committee?" And I said, "Well, I did 6 years." And they said, "Yeah, but after 2 you can come back." And I said, "There are 320 million or whatever people in the United States of America. I've already done my thing. You can't find somebody else." And they said, "We want you back as chairman."
That's great.
It was really, really nice.
Great.
So I agreed to go back, and now we're going through a transition to another administration, and we'll see how that all works out. But I haven't had the opportunity to meet Administrator Pruitt yet, but I'm looking forward to that.
So are you back on officially, or you have
well,
to, because this is a new administration, right?
The appointments were made last year, so they will be made.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
They stagger them.
So this is still the Obama group.
Yeah, right.
And then we'll just have to
Right.
see what they want to do
Great.
with the committees and so forth.
So
But
how
I think
often-
we've offered some really good advice over the years.
Well,
so.
I was checking a little bit. I must confess it's not in my pay grade. It's a little above my head. But for here in Vermont, and I'm so glad you write responses, and I've read some of your letters to the editor, and Digger covers them and stuff on Lake Champlain, on the clean water. I mean, this is important stuff, and we need people like you that get it. It's sort of over my pay grade, but I get the importance of having a clean lake and the impact to the economy. I get that part. I just don't know how to fix it. But
We just need to do it smart.
yeah, well, we're going to get to that later. I hit everybody up who maybe knows something about Lake Champlain, because I don't understand what we're doing. We have to fix it now. Period. That's my take. Sorry. Is that good?
That's good.
That's good.
Now the question is, do we mean now in geologic terms or political terms? Because those are very different time frames.
Oh, well, all right. I'm going to stop by asking my question. What does that mean?
Well, it took 100 years for the lake to get in its current situation.
Yeah.
Even if we were to effectively stem the pollution and the phosphorus going into the lake literally overnight, it's going to take
a while to recover.
decades for a significant recovery. You'll see some improvement relatively soon, within a year or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, something like that. But it'll take decades before you really see significant improvement, because that's how long it takes these systems to recover. That was one of the biggest problems. I think Governor Douglas's Clean and Clear initiative was a perfectly valid. It did have its flaws, and some of those have been addressed with Act 64 and so forth. No question about it. But for EPA to come in and say that's not working after 6 years, to come in and say that's not working, we're going to do it all over. EPA actually wrote the new TMDL, the Total Maximum Daily Load Plan. They threw out Douglas's plan, and they wrote their own plan, and that's what we're attempting to achieve now. now I understand that's CLF, Conservation Law Foundation, appealed. They filed the appeal a day or two before the end of the statute of limitations. You only have 6 years to appeal one of these loads, one of these
Right.
plans. And if they were going to appeal, they had to appeal then, or they would have given up their opportunity. But the problem is, 6 years was not enough time to really measure and evaluate whether or not
Impact.
it was going to succeed.
Yeah.
So the numbers were not good because it wasn't enough time, and EPA decided to throw it all out and start all
But
over
they should
again.
know that it takes time, should they not?
They know that, but those decisions are
Yep.
legal and political.
Now you're
They're
into
not-
political.
They're
Right.
legal and political, they're not just environmental. And,
Right.
and sometimes science and politics and the law,
Right.
they just don't agree.
Because we passed, when my last year in the House, we passed a pretty extensive bill about Lake Champlain. And we signed it and passed it. And then I ran a couple of years later for the Senate. And next thing I know, they're having an update on Lake Champlain while I'm a candidate. And I go and I'm like, what? I thought this was all fixed. Nothing happened. I think what happened is the economy sort of tanked and the money just wasn't there anymore. So we pretty much started over again.
They pretty
And-
much started
And
over again.
they assigned some money, I'm trying to remember the number, 45 million comes to mind, I don't know if that's, for clean water. But the trouble is, in the statute, it doesn't identify where the money's to be spent. It just says 40, if that's the right number, 45 million for,
Well, actually, over
Okay.
the period of years, it was about $100 million in combination of state and federal
Right.
funds that were spent under Clean and Clear. Governor Douglas's
Right.
plan was every penny of that spent to the maximum benefit of the lake. No, it
no,
wasn't.
right.
Was it all wasted? Absolutely not. A lot of very good work was done under that plan. The current regime, the way the legislature did it is they essentially, kind of with a gun to their head by EPA, to be fair. EPA was basically saying,
I remember they said, if you don't write it,
do
we
it or else.
will. Right.
Very bad
Yeah.
things will happen if you don't convince us that you can do this. And the legislature enacted Act 64, but in that instance, they basically said, okay, here's everything we're going to do, but they didn't have a price tag, and they didn't know where the money was going to come from. They didn't even know how much money it was going to take, and that's
Right.
what the Treasurer's report attempted to wrestle with, and that's what there's a working group that's working. I've been attending the meetings with great interest
Yes.
this summer to come forward with some specific recommendations for what new taxes or fees are going to be imposed and by whom in order to help fund this. But the funding requirements for this is not a few hundred million. We're in the billions of dollars now.
Right.
So it's real money.
And I think the treasurer was proposing that, that users pay a portion of the fee. And there was a discussion about how to set up regional.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there were several models that the treasurer proposed, and they're all on the table for this working group.
Yeah,
And those models, there was a whole big laundry list of various revenue sources, but the treasurer really focused on a parcel fee or a
right. parcel.
impervious surface fee, basically roofs, streets, parking lots, things the water runs off of, and you measure it, and then you charge people for how many square feet of this stuff that you've got on your property,
Yike.
or just a per parcel fee. Just, you have a parcel, you pay X. But the legislature, there was no specific recommendation or no detailed analysis in that report, and the legislature really had difficulty within the confines of the calendar to come up with a specific solution. So they created this working group whose job is to come up with specific proposed legislative language for how this gets done.
Right.
And we are talking about anywhere, depending on which numbers you use, anywhere from 25 to 50, 60 million dollars a
Right.
year in new taxes and or fees in order to fund.
Right.
That doesn't come close to funding the whole thing.
Right. Just get
That's
started.
just the state's
Right.
down payment
Yeah.
on what municipalities and
Well,
private
I
sector are
think,
going to have to pay.
Beth Pierce, as the treasurer, recommended that we could do state bonding.
And
which
actually,
I'm glad she at least put
they-
that on the
the
table.
treasurer's report came up with a 2 to 3 year plan for coming up with funding in the
Right.
near term, buying us time to figure out how to do it in the long term, and that plan was nothing short of brilliant.
Yeah, I had her on a week or two ago. I was so impressed.
Yeah.
She's great.
It's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
And the legislature, the governor tweaked it, but only around the edges, and the legislature adopted it.
Yeah, that's
so
great. Yeah,
It's a
she's
great
good.
plan.
So, yeah, because when we read things like blue-green algae bloom, phosphorus loading, high bacteria count, it doesn't sound good. And doggies dying, dogs die if
Yeah.
they eat that blue algae.
Yeah,
That's not good.
yeah, and we need to fix it.
Yes, we do, because I think we were talking at one show about the economic impact of that lake. It's enormous. We
Yeah.
would be ruined without the lake you could use it.
And it's not just a matter of its value from kind of an aesthetic, and I mean that in the broadest sense of
Yeah.
the word, aesthetic for the people who live here, but so many businesses, our
Right,
economy
sure.
to a large degree in New
Right.
York, depend heavily on the resource that it represents
Yeah,
as
because
an
we
economic
impact
engine.
Canada and New York too, because I thought we were all in this together, but apparently we are the major,
We
major-
deliver
yes,
the vast majority of the phosphorus comes
Right,
off of Vermont.
right.
Quebec, a small amount, and New York, even though they have a very long coastline, there isn't an enormous amount of agriculture or large communities there.
Right,
So
that's true.
I think 60 or 70%, something like that, of all the runoff actually comes from Vermont. So we're the lion's share.
We've met the problem, and it is us.
It is us.
It is us, so we should fix it. And I think people, if they understood, I really think most of us would step up and say, okay, do it, because taken as a separate issue, not mixed in with increased taxes, but I think if you looked at it separately, people would understand the implications of clean water, but also the lake and what it does.
Well, the tribal representatives on my EPA advisory committee
Right.
are fond of reminding us when this subject comes up, water is life.
And are they not right?
As Native
That's right,
American,
right.
it's water is life, and you protect water, you
Right.
protect life, and it's the truth.
Yep. And there's hunting. I mean, there's just everything. It depends on the streams and the quality of the water. Love it. Well, I was just disappointed that we're where we are. And I know it's tough to find money, but I think somebody better be creative.
Well, hopefully the working group will be bold and come up with something that the legislature,
That's
and the legislature is going to be under enormous pressure from all sides,
Right.
but because it's a lot of new money. But if they can come up with something that's generally perceived to be fair, equitable, and has a connection to the problem,
Yeah.
it's related to. That's why these parcel fees is coming off the land. That's really it. That's why those tend to be favored. But it's a whole new thing. So there are a lot of folks that
I don't think,
we probably are taxed enough, and we're not
well,
looking
that's-
for new ways
that's
to do
for
it. Is
sure,
not
but
not the best
from
thing we
a
could do.
federal perspective, I doubt this would be on the chopping block list. This is too important statewide, nationwide, right? Clean water, clean.
Yeah.
I would hope that we wouldn't see a reduction in funding from Washington on
Well,
this
there was
issue.
a proposal in the last budget, not the current one that's
being discussed.
but the previous one, to cut some of this stuff. And
Oh, really?
And the Congress, which was a Republican Congress,
Yeah,
said, no,
yeah.
we're going to continue to fund these things.
Right.
These are a priority.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, good. I would think so. So we're talking about your job in Rutland, and just want to switch gears a little bit, because having worked in Barry and reading some of the things about what you do in Rutland, I think all towns and cities sort of face the same problems. Infrastructure, when I was in transportation, infrastructure is old. The bridges, the pipes, the everything. And what's your responsibility first, to get this in perspective, beyond the water treatment? Because you have a huge responsibility.
Well, yeah, Rutland is small geographically. We're only 7 square miles, but about 16,000 people live there. We serve, 20, 30,000 people in terms of the infrastructure, visitors, and on a daily basis. So it's the wastewater system, including collection
Right.
and treatment. It's also the drinking water system, and we're very, very proud of our drinking water.
And it tastes good. May I say, I won't mention what town I'm not crazy about, but Rutland actually has very good water.
Well, we we're good at it.
Yes,
We've
you
got
are.
really good people, and we've got an amazing system. I still get eyebrows raised when I go to meetings and there are people from much smaller communities in Vermont, and they say, well, you know, our water pumping stations, blah, 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 and then they look at me and I go, we don't have any pumping stations. And they go, what do you mean? City of Rutland doesn't have, we're 100% gravity.
Wow.
Our entire system is gravity. Power can go out forever, but the water's going to be there.
It's going to run
And we've
down.
been very, very careful to protect that, both in the way we treat
Where
water.
is the power plant? Is it up high somewhere?
You mean the water
Speaking
treatment
of-
plant?
The water treatment plant, is that-
Yes, it's up in Rutland Town.
Okay.
It's on the side of Mendon Mountain,
Oh.
and it's been there since 1885. Well, that's the source of our water. We've had
Right.
that as a source since 1885. The plant was built in 1994 when I was mayor, actually, and it's a very. We love to give tours. It's a slow sand filtration plant, which is an antique technology. It's 400 years old, and it works beyond
That's
brilliant. And because we have extremely clean source water, we have our water source is surface water. It comes from a brook, and that's been the case since the 1880s.
Right.
And but back in the early, this is ancient history, but back in the early 1900s, there was a typhoid outbreak.
Whoa.
And it was tracked. There was half a dozen people died, a couple hundred people get sick, and they tracked it back to farms along the brook where we drew our water from. This was around 1911, if I remember correctly. And the city went on a buying spree, and they bought up the farms as fast as they could. We now own more real estate in our watershed than we
protect it.
occupy as a
Right,
city. We're
right.
the biggest taxpayer in Mendon.
Oh, wow.
Proud to do it. And as a result, we have extremely clean source water. It's very, very well
Great.
protected. We don't own everything. It's about 11,000 acre watershed, but we do regulate everything,
Yeah.
including that which we don't own. But we have very, very good water. However, I can't say the same about the pipes.
Right. That's what I was reading about.
Yeah, the distribution system is, right now we're replacing 1.25 miles of water mains, just finishing that project right now. But every year, we have a 100-year plan, and we need to spend $1 million a year
Whoa.
in 2015 dollars for 100 years to get all of the pipes in our distribution system. We have a little over 100 miles, all of those within their design life. And it'll take us 100 years to get there.
Wow.
We've got still the oldest pipe in the system was put in 1858, which is 2 years before Abraham Lincoln was elected president.
I read that. They mentioned, I said, Abraham Lincoln.
And I got to tell you something, I'm not going to pull that pipe out of the ground anytime soon, because I love telling people that
Right.
as a way of illustrating how old this stuff is. And that
But
may
how-
be the oldest one,
Is it
but
how
we have a
pure
huge
the water?
number from the 1800s.
Is it because of the quality of the water too, going through the pipes, that it's not
Well,
as much damage?
They really made good iron back in the 1800s.
okay.
It was really
quality
high
products, I
high
see.
quality product. But 120 years is about the most you can expect to get out of these iron pipes, and we're already pushing 150 plus in some cases. So
Wow.
we've got some catching up to do.
So how
but
do you-
here's the thing: we're just about spending $1 million a year, and if we can just sustain that for 100 years, we're going to make it.
Right.
So we don't have to raise rates in order to.
Right.
We just have to stick with it. We just have to stay on it.
Right.
But it is a century-long project to get us back in shape in terms of our distribution system. But we're doing it.
It's great. You gotta let people know all this. It's really amazing, because I was reading, and this is the part that's way over my head. You have 4 combined sewer overflows, and a lot of the problems that you've had have been on not very often, but on overflow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
What's
a
that?
big
Because I think
challenge.
this is something that other cities I know have a problem.
There
with.
are 17 communities in Vermont that have one or more locations where they have a combined system. I want to emphasize here that combined. This is, we're back on the sewer side again.
Yep,
We're-
right. No, that's okay, because you have to go slow with this one, because
Yeah,
I read it several times and I
we're
didn't
not on
understand.
water
Yeah,
anymore.
no.
We're on sewer. And the way the system was built, kind of the evolution of these things back you know, when Vermont was young, was people just ran a pipe out the back to the stream, and it just, whenever you flushed, it went to the stream and it went downstream.
Right.
Well, as they get more and more built up, the farms got subdivided and neighborhoods get built. This didn't work real well, so they ran big pipes along the streams to collect. So it didn't just dump it in the stream. It collected and went to the river, and then dumped it in the river, but it wasn't in the backyards of all the people who lived there. Back in the 1960s, it was sort of like, okay, we got to stop doing that because the people downriver don't particularly appreciate it, and the rivers are just foul, polluted, horrible. So then we built wastewater treatment plants, and so all of those pipes that used to go to the river then went to the treatment plant. And those treatment plants have been upgraded and upgraded. And now the wastewater, the affluent that we discharge to Otter Creek is cleaner than the water in Otter Creek. But back when they first plumbed all this together, they weren't treating anything. They were just delivering it to the nearest river or stream. And it didn't matter whether the pipe came from your toilet or whether it came from the catch basin in the street. So they used the same pipe. So for a lot of the city, and a very substantial amount of the city, and this is true in Barre and a lot of other communities in Vermont, anything in the Northeast or Upper Midwest, really. Anything that vintage, there's a lot of combined sewers. And that's fine because when it's raining lightly or when it's not raining at all, even if it goes down the catch basin, it's going through the treatment plant. So urban stormwater runoff is getting fabulous treatment. But when it rains hard, and we've seen more and more and more of this. I mean, the increase in intensity of rainstorms has been jaw-dropping. When it rains really, really hard, even for a short period of time, the plumbing can't handle it. So there's a safety valve, a relief valve built into the system. And you remember that pipe that used to go to the river? It's still there.
And
so that when there's too much water to get all the way or through the treatment plant, it bypasses that, and the combined stormwater and wastewater goes straight to the river untreated.
Whoa.
Now, it does this only under extreme weather events, but extreme weather events, in our case, happen 20 to 30 times a year. That is not good.
No. Do the people know this is happening?
Yes. The legislature last year, or was it the year before, passed a statute, and the agency did regulations mirroring it, requiring public notification, so that, especially in the summertime, if people are recreating, they need to know. They kind of need to know right away. So they made this statute that the agency now requires treatment plant operators to provide notice within an hour that an event is underway, and then within 12 hours, as much information as you can provide. You know, how much, when it started, when it stopped, blah blah blah. But the main thing is that alert that goes out quickly. The city, I pushed very hard for getting a better system of public notice because the obvious public health issues associated with that, and because we have altogether much too frequent overflows. So we go above and beyond what the statute requires. We post it on Facebook, and we get some interesting comments that I wince at.
Can't imagine.
And we also put it out on Twitter, and we get a lot of people, and it gets shared quite a bit. So the word gets out pretty well through social media, actually more effectively than the state.
It must clear up fast because there's a steady flow there.
Yeah,
so
it pretty much only happens when there's a great deal of stormwater. But the thing that I argue, because the first thing most people say is, you got to stop that. And put it where? But all the plumbing's all hooked together. And if, for example, if we were to go and separate, we just did a 50-acre separation a couple of years ago, $5.2 million. We got continuing projects to improve the situation. And if we were to do that everywhere we have combined sewers, it would be between $125 and $150 million just for the city. The city has 4 outfalls, and there are 66 outfalls statewide.
Oh, my word.
Nobody has enough money to do that. That's not going to happen. But more to the point, you don't want that to happen. This is an argument I'm making that people go, that doesn't make sense, but it's counterintuitive, but it's true. Because all the time it's not overflowing, which is 99.5% of the time or whatever it is, all that stormwater is going through the treatment plant. Otherwise, it would be going straight to the streams. If it was separated, it would be going straight to the streams with little or no treatment. So the benefit of combined sewers is huge when they're not overflowing, And then the problem is when it overflows. So the challenge is to minimize the frequency or the likelihood that you're going to have an overflow, but don't separate the system out. In 2015, we did the math. In 2015, our treatment plant, which can handle 22.5 million gallons a day of combined wastewater and stormwater, treated 500 million gallons of just urban stormwater.
Wow.
To a degree that it was cleaner than the river it went into.
Right.
We don't want to throw that away. We don't want to separate everything. We can't afford to do it anyway. We want to address the combined sewer overflow problem by, there's 3 ways to do it, but by doing a combination of 3 different things, 3 different technologies that could get us down to something, hopefully, the engineering is now just beginning, but hopefully to something like you would have an event maybe once every 5 years. Right. And with public notice and everything else, that might be cost effective and doable, from an engineering standpoint, from a financial standpoint, and at the same time get all the benefit of urban stormwater being treated through the wastewater treatment plant.
Was Irene, I was trying to think, it's a tropical storm, not a hurricane.
Yeah.
That must have really kept you busy. Huh?
Well, I wasn't, that was before I
Was
started.
that before you started?
That was before I started.
Good
but actually,
timing.
Irene was not a problem for our wastewater treatment plant.
Really?
Yeah, this is about intensity. It isn't about the volume of water. Irene rained a lot, but it was steady and it was over many, many, many hours.
Because Route 4 going into Rutland didn't fare very well.
We were completely isolated.
Yeah.
You couldn't get in or out of the city
That's true.
in any direction for a day. But the treatment plant could handle Irene.
Wow.
It can't handle. We just had on July 1st, we had a downpour. It lasted about 10 minutes. And during that 10 minutes, it was raining at the rate of 8 inches an hour.
Oh my gosh.
From a thunderstorm.
Whoa.
8 inches an hour. There's no infrastructure anywhere that can handle 8 inches.
Well, the
an
ground
hour.
can't even absorb that.
Of course,
that
it
fast.
just.
Right.
I mean, every road was curb to curb river.
Right.
That's the kind of storm
Right.
that we're probably never going to be able to handle. But that's fortunately still rare. I mean, that's not only rare. I mean, I don't know that we have one on the books that was that intense. But they're becoming more frequent.
But people must understand that if they take the time to listen to you and because it makes sense to me. Why spend all that money for that one?
And the thing is,
that
the water quality will be worse.
Right.
Because all the time that it rains, that right now 500 billion gallons is going through the treatment plant. Now that just goes to the streams without any treatment or minimal treatment. And as a result, water quality, even if we never did anything with CSOs, which we have to do, but even if we never touched them, water quality would degrade if we separated it. If we spent $150 million to separate everything, it would be worse off.
Over my
The engineers and the biologists all agree with that. So we have to come up with a better answer.
What is your education background in? Is it just?
I got a bachelor's degree in physics and a master's degree in management.
There you go.
Yeah,
no wonder you're so good at
left
managing.
brain, right brain, or
there you
something
go.
like
Yes,
that.
exactly. So now we have to skip because we have about 20 minutes left because I really want to talk about your being mayor and also working for the state. And I know
Ancient history.
Yes, I was there. Are we ancient? We're not ancient
well,
yet.
I look in the
I
mirror
remember
every morning.
everything. But when you served as mayor, you did a lot of work, which is one of my favorite subjects, is permit process. But you also did a lot on recycling, which sort of started according to this article, started the ball rolling on recycling.
Yeah,
Is
that
that
was
you?
kind of one of my pet
That was amazing.
priorities.
It's taken me a while, but I've gotten into the.
We
I've gotten into it.
we did a mandatory recycling ordinance in the city that didn't mandate that people recycle. It mandated that haulers offer recycling at no extra charge.
Oh, excellent.
So they had to build it into their
Right.
rates, and that you couldn't hire a hauler and say, I don't want to pay for recycling, because
Right.
he was going to offer it to you whether it was going to be the same price.
That's the
either
way
way.
to get them to do it, right?
And making it convenient.
Yeah.
And a lot of enormous progress has been made in Vermont on that since the early 90s when we did that. But we were the first community to make that a priority. And when I became a Rutland County Solid Waste District Manager, I was able to kind of get really into it.
Into it.
Into it on a regional basis. So that was one thing. One of the things I was, and continue to be honest, somewhat of a critic of Act 250, and not its goals or purposes, but it's kind of administration.
Right.
To be fair,
It's too much.
it's administration,
Yep.
and it's to a degree overreach, especially where municipalities are already doing many of these
Agreed.
things very effectively,
Right.
and now we have to do it again
Yep.
through Act 250. And so I was pretty critical of Act 250. So when I got elected mayor, I said, well, I better clean up my own house, because if I'm living in a glass house, if I'm going to throw a rock at Act 250, and we have a broken permit process, that's not acceptable. So what we did is we first evaluated how long it took, this is just building permits, right? How long it took to get a non-controversial building permit through the process, and it was something like 34 days or something like that. And then, so we did an analysis, how much time does it spend at each stage and that kind of thing. And these are the ones that just go through. Then we did an evaluation to say, okay, what can we change administratively? What can we change in terms of process? What can we change in our ordinance to bring that down to 10 days?
Right.
Just
Good-
pick
good
a
for you.
number. 10 days. We want to do it in 10 days. If it's non-controversial, we can turn it around in 10. And came up with a list, negotiated it out with the Board of Aldermen to get the kind of statutory changes needed. I didn't get everything I wanted, but I got 90%, which was good. And then we did an evaluation a couple of years later, and it was 5.5 days.
Wow, Jeff, that's
Now again,
great.
that's not the ones that have
Yeah.
appeals,
Yeah,
but these are the ones that just should be able to move. So
right.
I felt pretty comfortable that
great.
that was a good way to analyze it. So when Governor Douglas called me up and asked me if I'd be interested in being appointed Commissioner of Environmental
Right.
Conservation, he was aware of this. He knew my history.
Yeah.
And he said, you don't suppose you might be able to do something like that for DEC? And I said, well, I wouldn't promise we could do it in 5 days.
Yeah, right.
But I said, sure, absolutely. I'd love to tackle that.
Do you know, every business person I've had on this show, they have said they just want two things. Consistency, they want to know what they're getting into, how long in time and how much will it cost. That's all they care about. Just let them know,
I've
is
heard-
this going to be a 6-month deal, a year deal, a 10-day deal? Just let us know.
I've heard the same thing for decades.
Yeah.
And the main concern is it's really not about standards. That's the thing. I remember I was speaking with someone, I won't mention names, but I was speaking with someone who made a decision not to expand in Vermont, but instead to build their needed facility in Massachusetts,
Yeah.
Western Massachusetts. And this was when I was DEC commissioner, and I don't want to know why.
Right.
And so, and the main concern was, and this was a DEC issue, was wetlands.
Right.
There were wetlands in
Interesting.
both locations that
Right.
had to be addressed. In Massachusetts, they actually had, and I don't know what it is today, this was 10
Yeah,
years ago
right.
or more, but in Massachusetts, they actually had more stringent wetland standards than we had in Vermont. But
Wow.
they had a process where here are the standards, they were black and white, and they could get the decision in a matter of a couple of weeks,
Wow.
3 weeks, something like that. In Vermont, it was, well,
Let's see.
we're going to have to ponder it, and
Yeah.
then we're going to have to, and that was the problem. Massachusetts was actually doing a better job of protecting wetlands than Vermont was. And the work and the jobs and the investment and everything went to Massachusetts, which had higher standards. But because it was certainty, and because the regulators, or at least the legislators, or whoever it was that set up the system
Right.
down there, understood that this is what the business community, they weren't worried about meeting a high bar. They were worried about getting an answer on a timely basis.
Exactly, exactly. I really thought and hoped after Irene, when we went back to the legislature that year, it was going to be just a revamping of the regulations because.
Look what we learned.
Yes.
Look what we learned.
But because it's not either or. It's not either building or constructing or environment. You can really do it combined and
one
with
of the
some
things we
sense.
also checked when we did and we've watched this at DEC, but when we did the building permit exercise in Rutland, we also watched what our oops rate was, because making errors. It turned out that we made far fewer errors when we turned a building permit around in 5 days than we did when we turned it around in 34 or 33 or whatever the original number was.
What was that? What was the cause of that?
Because we just did a better job. I mean,
Yeah, because they knew they had time, so
well,
they just left over
the main
things?
reason was we created an administrative committee which went by the wayside in the administration that followed mine, and Mayor Allaire has just recreated it.
Great.
Thank you. But we created it's an administrative committee, and once a week we get everybody who has to approve a building permit around the table, same time, every single week, same day. If you've got an application, you want to pitch it, you come right in there, and it's evaluated, and everybody hears what everybody else says. It's literally it's
great.
done right then and
Good
there.
for Dave.
It doesn't take weeks to take it from the police chief
Right.
to the fire chief to the city engineer to carry it around, and it sits on somebody's desk for 5 days while
Right.
they're busy with their stuff. No, just show up at the meeting. If you got a problem and you need information, send it back.
Right.
But if you're good with it, it's done.
Well,
It's
didn't
done
you
in
learn,
an
I'm just
hour.
thinking, when you study management, you're supposed to only deal with a piece of paper one time.
Yeah.
That's a sign of a good manager. If it keeps coming back to your desk, you've done something wrong,
Yeah,
right?
handle. Yeah, that's
exactly.
right.
That's
And
great.
also, when you handle it multiple times, every time you create an opportunity to make a mistake.
Right, that's
The
true.
fewer times you handle it, the less
Right.
likely there's going to be an error, and that's what we discovered.
That's great.
And when at DEC, the governor asked me, can you do this? But the main thing was, this was 2003. There was this huge issue with a backlog of permits. There were 3,000 expired
Wow.
permits in several programs. The biggest one was the stormwater program that had been allowed to be expired, and now people couldn't sell their properties because they didn't have clear title.
Oh,
You remember
wow.
that whole thing?
Yes, I do,
So
actually.
the governor said, this has got to get fixed. And so we internally in the agency, or in the department, put together a working group, came up with a plan for eliminating the backlogs, and in 3 years, we got 3,000 permits done.
Wow,
And we
good
didn't
for you
add
guys.
100 staff to do that.
Right.
In fact, in one case, this was the biggest, single biggest challenge, I think, certainly for that program, is the legislature in the waning days of the Dean administration had passed what was called universal jurisdiction. Prior to that, you remember, a lot of people remember the old 10-acre exemption.
Oh, I
So that
do
you didn't have
remember
to get a
that.
permit for your
Right.
on-site system if you had 10 acres. You figured somewhere in 10 acres has got to be good soil,
Right.
right? Well, Vermont was the last state in the nation to have 50% of all the on-site wastewater systems and wells
Right,
unregulated.
right.
So the legislature said this is going to stop, and they gave, I think, 5 years. It was 5 years to get it in place. And we had the largest programs, like 54, 55 staff in 6 locations in DEC, spread all around the state. And we were going to get 2 additional staff. We're going to double the jurisdictional reach
Wow.
of that program overnight. On the end of June, the jurisdictional reach is X thousands, and on July 1st, it's 2 times
Right.
X thousands. And they're going to have twice as many applicants and everything else, and we're going to get 2 more staff people to do this. So needless to say, we're not doing it the way we used to do
Exactly, streamline.
it. And we brought everybody in. We did this thing called a Kaizen process,
Oh
which
my
is
God, I remember
a
that.
Japanese
Yeah.
model, which worked really well.
Right.
And it basically caused everybody, because everybody had their little piece, and they knew their piece inside
was
and out, but
doing
nobody
that?
knew the whole
Who
thing.
was doing Kaizen for you?
Brendan Cosgrove
I just,
was
Brendan,
the
I
one
couldn't-
who was
sorry,
the one
Brendan.
who
Yes, he
Yeah.
was like the walking expert on Kaizen.
Oh, well, he was there, and
He
he
was
was a
great.
great believer. And we ended up with this, and it worked.
Yeah.
It absolutely worked.
Right.
We had to change the way we processed this,
Right.
but we were able to handle it. We had to make some investments, and at the time, I was embarrassed at how much money we were spending on IT. However, more recent experiences, boy, did we get off cheap. We didn't even spend $1 million.
Yeah, exactly.
But we had to digitize 600,000 historical
Oh,
documents
wow.
and get them all up on the web for this to work. That was one of the critical
Yeah,
pieces.
right.
And we hired a Vermont software company from Burlington. We didn't have to go to some national
Yeah.
company. And over a 3-year period,
They did
it was online.
Wow.
The realtors, the engineers, everybody could go on. They could look up the permits. It was all map-based. And it worked. It
I
absolutely
think
worked.
this
And we did it
administration,
cheap compared to
this
more recent.
administration is still talking about that effort when they were talking about streamlining and stuff, about the permitting process in DEC.
Yeah, it slipped again. It slipped again under the prior administration, and there's a significant backlog for different reasons. They did have staff cuts and funding cuts and that kind of thing, but there are always opportunities
Yep.
to do things more efficiently.
Yep.
And when you, I swear, when you do it, and you look at it from a standpoint efficiency, both time and accuracy.
And it helps with the employees' morale, may I say. When I did the similar thing in motor vehicles, because every day they'd come home knowing they hadn't
Yeah.
finished, and then they're not that they're excited about DMV, but they were pretty proud of what they accomplished.
I
when
loved
you- when
working
you
with
were there.
Bonnie Rutledge.
Oh, I know, isn't she wonderful?
Yeah, I loved working with
Yes,
her.
I bet they miss her over there. They do. So I'm sure you're keeping track of what DEC is involved in and stuff. What are there different issues between when you were there and now, or it's changed a little
It's
bit?
shifted a little, but stormwater, which
Still.
was kind of the cross I
Right.
bore, is still right there.
Yeah.
We made some progress, but to a large degree, all the litigation around it really set things back. And, you know,
Decisions from courts or just time-wise?
well,
Or all the
lawsuits
above?
from CLF
Oh.
in particular. And at one point, I was so frustrated with you'd come up with, here's plan F, going down the alphabet, because the other
Yeah, there are six.
have
that
all
right.
been thrown out, and then that one would get challenged. And I actually did the math, just to, it was back of the envelope stuff, but how many tons of pollutants had gone needlessly to Lake Champlain because we
while
were
they're
spending
doing-
years in court and we couldn't regulate.
Right,
We had perfectly valuable
right.
regulatory frameworks that, for one reason or another, did not pass muster with the court. This is a case where science and the law conflict.
But each one of them must have moved the needle a little bit forward. may
Yeah,
not
well,
have
it didn't
been-
seem like we were making much progress
No,
the
that's
first 2
sad.
years. But we did eventually get something that the courts finally acknowledged, although it's goofy, I have to admit, but the logical ones weren't supported by the law. They were supported by, environment and
Right,
science
right.
and
Interesting.
budgets and things.
Have to do a show on that.
But the law, the Clean Water Act, I'm not blaming the legislature
Right.
here, the Clean Water Act, the interpretations of the Clean Water Act, oh no, you got to go back and start all over again. Well, we finally came up with something that passed
you?
muster,
Good,
and that's what we're working under now, but it is not efficient.
Interesting.
And it continues to be a source of a lot of concern.
I told you this hour goes fast. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you'd like to mention? Or I'll have you come back. There's a couple of things you brought up that I'd really like to talk about more.
I don't know, what else you got on your list?
Well, it's really just looking at the administration now and what their future, where they're headed.
Yeah.
If
Well, they're
there's
going to have a
anything,
huge challenge, not knowing what's going to happen with EPA's budget
Right.
under the new administration. A third of the funding for DEC comes from EPA.
oh,
We do not want to be in a situation, I looked at this and we evaluated it, but we did not want to be in a situation where Vermont no longer administers the Clean Water Act or some of these other key national environmental statutes, because can you imagine Vermont businesses and individuals having
Right.
to go down to Boston for a permit?
oh, well, I've invited Governor Governor Scott on the show, and I'm going to, we'll ask him that. Jeff, it's been great seeing you. Thank you very
It's
much.
been a
Thank you all
pleasure.
for tuning in. This man is amazing. I really enjoyed working with him. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week, and in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites. Gotcha.